Okay, good morning. Ayin Beis, volume 3. We're close to the bottom of page 1303, Aleph Shin Gimel. So we learned yesterday was, first of all, that Malchus, like Keren, like a corner point, is a connector. It doesn't add anything, but it connects two realities. And he gave the example of Melucha Lamata, which is essentially when a king assumes being a king, what happens is there's a Hischabros HaMelech Im Ha'am. There's a connection between the Melech, the king, and the nation and the people. So even though beforehand he existed, but there was no Melucha, and the Melech was Bifnei Atzmei, and the Am was Bifnei Atzmei. The king was separate, the Melech was separate. And then when they came together, and the Inyan Meluch is they come together, connecting the two. And the Melech on his own is completely removed, Meshicha Ma'ila V'Gavoya, like the Spheres of Atzilus on their own are beyond Biy'a, and Melucha, Malchus, connects it with the people, which in this case with Biy'a, Atzilus and Biy'a. Then the next piece we learned, the new paragraph, is that every connection between two levels, upon them rests and is drawn an energy that's higher than both of them, and that's the mamutza interface that connects them. Like Zoch and Akeva bottom ve'yavarach, that comes about Torah she'itra le'imay, b'im chasanose, it's l'mayla from Zoh, and that connects Zoh and Malchus. The same thing in Malchus, being that is the end of Atzilus and the beginning of Biy'a. And that means that so it's higher than both of them, and that's how Malchus is rooted in Radlah. That's higher than the root of the 9 spheres, which are rooted in Arich. Like he explains in Teira that Malchus is rooted all the way because it connects two opposites. It's rooted in Malchus of Ein Sof, which is higher than the root of Atzilus. That's why it has the power to connect. That's what we learned yesterday. So I'm going to continue now from the line that begins. Yeah. Well, one more thing we learned. One more thing. However, this Koyach Elyon and Malchus is in a state of concealment. Just as it is Be'etzim and Hel Ma'atzmi, also Malchus is in a state of concealment. And it comes revealed when it connects the two realities of Atzilus and Biy'a or Biy'a. Now, so now I'm going to begin. The line is 7 lines from the bottom of the page. The line that begins Li'adei Hizgalus, Adei Chabrus, Adei Hizgalus, Adei Chabrus. And that's what we'll start, and the pages can be found at ayinbeis.com. So here's what he says now. Tehine, now, and now, Ha'yischabru the B'chinas Malchus. This attachment, this connector of Malchus, that it connects two realities, Atzilus and Biy'a, or Biy'a. B'chinas Malchus shemechaberes Atzilus and Biy'a, that attaches and connects Atzilus with Biy'a, Biy'a Tzirasiyah, this connection, this attachment is in two ways, or two manners. One is from the top down. In order to create the world of Biy'a. So Malchus plays the role that it's like the mamutza that allows the higher energy of Atzilus to create the world of Biy'a. That's Mavhulis Misavas Biy'a Shazo Dafka Mamshochas Ha'orad Atzilus HaMahava. So this is coming from Atzilus, which is the creative force, the creator. That's the force that creates. But the creation is implemented through and channeled through Malchus as it's known. That's what he says here. So that's Mamayla Lamata. And And what is this connection that Malchus creates? So what does Malchus do? Malchus ensures that there should be a very diminished reflection from Atzilus, Biy'a, from Atzilus to Biy'a, being that Biy'a is so distant from Atzilus, because it's a created reality and Atzilus is an emanated divine reality. So Malchus plays the role of creating a very diminished flow. And the energy of Atzilus gets concealed and covered in order to allow and facilitate the creation of Nivraim, creations who are in a state of a yesh. They have an identity, they have a substance. In Atzilus, the spheres are all bottle, they're all about expressing the divine. But in order to create Biy'a, where there's a mitzvah of Nivraim, independent entities with independent consciousness, what he calls a yesh, that's where Malchus comes into play, that it diminishes and the energy gets concealed and covered, and that becomes the connector. So this is the first thing in the connection between Atzilus and Biy'a, from the top down, in order to create. Now he's going to talk about the second aspect of this connection. However, now, the primary connection between that Malchus creates between Atzilus and Biy'a, is a connection that goes from the bottom up. That Malchus comes to cause and facilitate a sublimation, a dedication of the Nivraim, and a unification of them into godliness. This is dafke through Malchus. So we see now that Malchus has two roles. One is in the creation process, and one in the reunification and reconnecting process. So in the process of creation, Malchus serves as the role, like the interface, like we learned. That's like the corner that connects Atzilus to Biy'a, and the flow of the energy diminishes it and conceals it. So Nivraim can emerge and be created. But the primary connection is really connecting the Nivraim back to godliness of Atzilus. And that too is the role of Malchus, and he calls that actually the Ikar Hischabus. Now the truth is, he hinted to this earlier. If you may recall, the top of the page, in the second line, the parentheses, he said in Binyan Malchus, there's Shalatzedech Hayesavus, there's the Binyan Malchus that's necessary for creation, Ulatzedech Hayichud, and the Binyan Malchus that's necessary for Yichud, the unification, Lias Gili Eir. So it seems like this is similar to the two that he's describing here. Okay. And now he's going to elaborate some more on this second level of the connection that Malchus connects the Nivroim, as he says, that there should be bitl ha-Nivroim. So it's interesting. On one hand, when you create something like a teacher to a student, the teacher has to diminish the energy to the point that the student can receive it. On the other hand, that diminishing and everything it does also serves a second role. It ultimately connects the student to the teacher. So there's 2 points in Malchus. One is the diminishing in order to transmit and create the creation, the Nivraim, the creatures, the creations. And the second is the bitl and the chibur that creates the bitl. Ukiyadua. The Zohar Malchus. I'll tell you where it is. It's in the drawer, the first at the top. 1 minute, guys. The top or the second one? You have it? Okay. And the second is the Ikar Ischabrus, that's Bisha Bitlan Nevroim, and connecting them with the divine, with Elikus. Ukiyadua, the Zohar Malchus is now going to explain how that works. It's known that Zohar and Malchus, which has been the operative terms here, Zohar is the 6 midas from Chesed to Yesod, that we before identified as being the spheres, part of the spheres. And Malchus, of course, is Malchus. He says, Ayin Beis shebemutza sheben Erein Sof Biy'a. So Chassidus explains, and Ayin Beis, he explained this at length a number of times, that when you talk about the interface between Erein Sof and Biy'a, like every interface has to have two parts to it. So even though Malchus is the interface that he's discussing here, but when you break it down, it's really consists of Zoh and Malchus. They're the two levels of a mamutza, with Zoh representing more the Erein Sof, and Biy'a, Malchus representing more the connection to Biy'a. The Bchinas, next page. We're on top of page 1304. The Bchinas Zoh, who Seifa Elama Ein Sof. So Zoh is sometimes referred to the end of the world of Ein Sof. Now I know you'll say, 1 second, isn't Ein Sof higher than Atzilus and higher even than the Tzimtzum? So everything is relative. Relative to Biy'a, which is the main place where creation takes place. So remember, Atzilus is a divine world. It is a creation and a world, but we call it Atzilus. We call it an emanation, not a Bria, which is a creation. So relative to Biy'a, Atzilus is a form of Elikus, and Zoh is considered to be the end of the world of Ein Sof. Sheboy mitzamtzemim kol ha'eres alyenim. There in Zoh, all the higher energies of the divine are mitzamtzem, are diminished. Sheyeh be'efsher, in order to create the ability, lizgalus be'biyah liyazgila elikus, that they should be able to be revealed in Biy'a and reveal godliness. And going back to the example, just like a good teacher who's a brilliant teacher has to conceal and diminish the brilliance of his ideas for the students to be able to receive it. How much more so when we're talking Biy'a in comparison to Atzilus. So Zoh is the place where, so even though on one hand Zoh is Sof Elama Ein Sof, it's divine emotions. It's chesed of God, it's gvura of God, it's God's compassion, L'cha Hashem Agdula Gvura V'Tiferes, it's God's netzach, it's God's hoid and God's yesod. So on one hand, it represents godliness, godly faculties, godly attributes, I should say. But on the other hand, they're already becoming diminished in the state called Zoyer Ampin, which means a small face, like he's going to explain now. So they're being channeled now and being prepared to be able to be received and revealed in Biy'a. Like he says now, the Zeusha Nikra Zoyer Ampin. That's why it's called Zoyer Ampin, which means literally a small face, a small structure. Because it's a state of diminishment, a state of a microcosm, a katnus, which is a diminished state, like a less mature state, from the level of Arechampin, which is the long face or the large face, like we learned earlier. So if you talk about Keser, Arechampin, there the energy is far more unlimited. That's why it's a super conscious of Keser. But as it comes into Zoh, so it's the end of the world of Ein Sof, but it's now in a diminished state called Zoyer Ampin, the small face, Katnus. So it's been channeled into a smaller state, into a more diminished state. The Chol Ha'aras, the Arech Ampin, because all the reflections from Arech Ampin, from the root Arech Ampin, Shem B'Bchinas Gvul. Let me change the nigun. The Chol Ha'aras, the Arech Ampin, Shem B'Bchinas Bli Gvul, because all the reflections from Arech Ampin, which are in the form of Bli Gvul, without limit. That's why it's called Arich Ampin, the long face. They all are channeled and come into Zah in a form of limit, parameters, and Simtsum diminished. It's being primed and prepared that there can be a Gili and Biy'a. That's the Mamutza Mitzada Ein Sof. Like every interface, like we learned, if you remember the end of volume 2, that the ayin between Yesh and Yesh breaks into two, the ayin of the Yesh Amiti and the ayin of the Yesh Anivra. So every interface, when you break it down, has two sides, one that represents the top level and one that represents the lower level. We'll soon learn in a moment, Malchus represents the lower level. But before that, let me just explain in some Chabad terms, what are we talking about here exactly when we say that Zohar Ampin is a form of Hagbola and Simtsum in order for there to be a Gili and Biy'a. So, we'll explain it with a human example. Every person, every human being, and especially a developed person who's reached high levels, a tzaddik, and so on, has within them dimensions that we can't access. When you talk about the supraconscious, or let's call it Ratzon, the will of a tzaddik, let's say, of a Rebbe, of a Moshe Rabbeinu, that's pretty much inaccessible to us. We may know what his will is, but with the intensity as it is within his own psyche and his own being, remains removed from us. How do we get access to it? We get access to it by him revealing his desires in his emotions. So when he tells us, this is what my chesed is like, this is what I want, or this is what I love, and this is my gvura, and this is my teferes, and the same thing with netzach chayid yesod. So then we're getting it through his revealed attributes, is revealing to us, to the nivroim, to the makablim, to the recipients, something from the hidden dimensions of the giver. Same thing is above. When you talk about God's will, which is Arich Ampin, that's something that's removed from us. God wants something, desires something. If you want to access it, we have to have it translated in some form of structure. So the structure of Zohar Ampin, like he says, channels Arich Ampin, but in a very direct way where the Biy'a, where the creation can relate to it. And we can relate to God through his chesed, through his gvura, when God does kindness with us, when God is disciplined in the state of judgment or elikim, and God's compassion, God's endurance, and God's victory, and so on. So that's why Zohar Ampin gives us some form of appreciation and recognition of God's attributes. If we didn't have God's attributes, it would be very hard to relate to the Eibishter himself. So even though we say about davening, Chol Kareinu Elov V'Leil Midesav, we're calling to God, we're praying to God, and not to his attributes, but his attributes allow us a handle to relate to him. So when God is doing kindness, you can relate to the Shem Kale in the form of kindness. Like we say, the names of Hashem, I relate to Fi Maisi Ani Nikra. According to my actions, I'm called. I'm named by my actions. So when we say, for example, on Rosh Hashanah, that we want God to go from Midas Hadin to Midas Harachamim, that from judgment and severities should go to compassion, these are attributes we can relate to. This is discussed at length in Sherish Mitzvah Satfila by the Tzemach Tzedek, that when we daven, we're davening to God, but we can relate to God through his attributes. And each attribute has a particular function. So essentially saying that Zohar, like he says, allows Arich Ampin to come in at Tzimtzum in a way that should be revealed in Biy'a. So that prepares so-called the teacher, the giver, in this case, the God, to be able to relate to us. But we still need a mamutza from the Nevroim's end. How does the Nevroim, what do they have within them? That's so-called the teacher preparing himself and saying, okay, I'm going to give you Zohar Ampin, I'll give you a piece of myself through my attributes. But now we need to know what is the mamutza from the recipients and mamata lamayla. So here's what he says: Ubchinas hamamutza shemitzad hanevroim, And the level of interface from the perspective of the Nevraim, the creations, the creatures, who B'chinas Malchus Atzilus. That's the level of Malchus of Atzilus. So here we have Zoh and Malchus. They speak to each other. Zoh represents the upper end. Malchus represents the lower end, because Malchus is going to speak to Biy'a. And that's what Malchus does. The Eliezer B'chinas Mokar Kol HaNevraim, being that Malchus is the source for all the creations, Al Kain, Hi Payeles Habitl B'kulam. That's why it has the power to cause them to be sublimated or subjugated or become committed to and devoted to the bitl, to Elikus. So Zoh gives us a taste of the divine in a way we can relate to. And Malchus creates the bitl of Nevraim that they should be able to receive it. Because remember, the Nevraim on their own, the creations on their own, are in a state of yesh, identity, their own ego. But Malchus creates the bitl that they need in order to receive and connect with the divine. Commission is barely il dibra maskal vayidaber Pinchas ben Elazar. Like we learned earlier in the Maimer of Pinchas ben Elazar, which, as he says here, is in volume 2, page 1065. Anybody want to ask anything? Let me stop here for any questions.
The Malchus is creating the Bitul, but it's also creating that it's not Nimshach the Zoh in the way that the Zoh is, because the Nevroim are not able.
That's correct.
Right?
Yeah. That's what he said on the bottom of the previous page. Correct. He said, if you look, he said, Chabes chen Malchus mechaberes Atzilus and Biy'a bebezei fanim. Ha'echad mamayl lamata v'liyas yisaves Biy'a. Shezeo dafka mamshach zor d'Atzilus ha'ma'av rakshel de'ah Malchus dafka. And that's the Orem Mitzumtzemes. So yes, Zoh takes from Arichampin, from like Bligvul, and turns it into Gvul. But it's still quite intense. And Malchus diminishes it further to be able to create Biy'a. But then there's the second half of it, which he said, the Iker Hischabus is Malchus is also causing a bitl. Remember, Malchus, even when it's drawing down the energy into Biy'a, still retains its Malchus of Atzilus qualities. So then it turns, Biy'a gives us the ability to have the bitl to be able to reunite and reconnect with Atzilus. So correct what you said, yes. So you need Zoh and Malchus to draw down, and then Malchus is the Mamutza Mitzad Nevraim to reconnect, what he just said now. And he's going to explain further what that means. Are there any other questions before I read on?
Yeah, I think I'd asked it before, but I just want to clarify. Zoh, when we said that, like that analogy of the two side walls, the southern side and the eastern side, and the meeting, sort of like Malchus and to Biy'a, Atzilus and to Biy'a. Am I right in understanding that there's, when Zoh is integrated into Malchus, descends into Malchus of Atzilus, then that side wall, so to speak, that analogy, is existing on its own. It's not automatically, when Zoh comes into Malchus of Atzilus, it's not automatically already connected to the eastern wall. The eastern wall being Biy'a, the next that location. There's a second step required for Malchus to descend, so to speak, into Biy'a, which would be that descending would be now the hischabrus of the two walls at the point at the Keren Hazavis. Is that correct? There's a separate step required, meaning the wall is the eastern wall or southern wall is separate by standing by itself, and then there's another step where they become Malchus descends and connects the two walls.
Yeah. What other option is there?
There isn't. No, that automatically that when Zoh comes into Malchus Atzilus, there's automatically a connection that happens.
I mean,
sort of like
automatic. I don't know
into
what the word automatic means, but it's clearly Malchus is the point where the two worlds connect. So Zoh alone would still represent Atzilus, and Biy'a would represent the other wall. And it's Malchus that becomes the fastener, the one that fastens or unites, the juncture where they meet. Correct. I don't know if it's automatic or not automatic. It all depends what automatic means. When God creates, that's what he uses, Malchus, to achieve that. He's now explaining that Malchus has, in connecting the two, there are two aspects to it. One is connecting them to create Atzilus, to create Biy'a, and the other is connecting them that Biy'a elevates and unites with Atzilus. That's what he's saying here. But it's true, it's only Malchus that is considered the Keren Zovis, not Zoh.
But as when Zoh, I know I'm not talking about Zoh here. When Zoh comes into Malchus of Atzilus, is you said that it creates Biy'a, so to speak, and that Biy'a is what I'm assuming is the second wall. So as soon as it gets filled up, Malchus, which as we said is Nakuda itself, it doesn't have any other
Malchus
spherot
is like
in
the
it.
corner
Right.
between Atzilus
It gets filled
and
up
Biy'a.
with Zoh.
Is that clear? Malchus
Yeah,
is
the corner, yes.
point between
But my question
Atzilus
is
and Biy'a.
the corner
So what's
already?
missing? What is unclear?
Whether there's
Malchus is the corner.
Is there a corner before there's another wall?
What do you mean? There's only one corner between two walls, and that's Malchus.
So, but is there a second step required for there to we just said that Malchus of Atzilus creates Biy'a, and I'm just saying
creates Biy'a through Malchus of Atzilus.
Right, through Malchus of Atzilus.
Okay.
So
and that's that's aspect number one, that Malchus is the corner that connects the two by creating it. And then is the corner that connects the two by uniting it in the bittul.
So there is two steps, so to speak. Okay.
It's not two steps. He calls it two fanim. The words he uses at the bottom of page 3.
Oh, two fanim.
Use the word. Two fanim, and this is chabrus.
Gotcha. Okay, two fanim. Okay.
One is mamayla lamata. Remember, a corner connects two things. It's one in the corner in a physical sense. It's only one corner, and that's it. But here, the corner is connecting a higher level to a lower level, and a lower level to a higher level. Basically, these are the two efanim, the two aspects of it.
All right. Yep.
Good.
It sounds to me, Reb Simon, that he explained before that Malchus could mechaber beis hafochim. Why cannot Zoh go directly to Biy'a? Because Zoh is an entity. Malchus is not having an entity. It just accepts everything. There is no entity by itself, Malchus. And this could be only because it's the build of Malchus, the Ein Sof. So since there's no entity, that's why this could go down to Biy'a and it's pale the bittul in the Biy'a.
That's correct. That is correct. The Malchus basically is mitziuse is bittul. So that's why I can bring bittul into Biy'a. Zoh is bittul telekus, but it has a mitzius of elikus, a tzir of gedusha. It's a structure, like you just said. It has an identity. Correct.
I have a small question I've been meaning to ask for a couple of days now. Can you hear me, Rabbi Jacobson?
Go ahead.
It said a few paragraphs or so. It said that Malchus is Nakuda Achas, and it explains how its constitution differs from the other spheres of Atzilus. I'm talking about here about Malchus of Atzilus. Its constitution differs because it draws from the Malchus of each of the spheres, other spheres, rather than having its own distinct nature, Bekitzer. And when we talk about, like you just said, maybe one of its perhaps most primary qualities is its bittul. So and because it's a mamutza and it channels, it's basically like train. It's like Grand Central Station between going this way, going that way. It sounds like a chalal, like it's an open sphere rather than a nekuda achas. I think of chachma as like nekuda achas. But I guess I don't understand why he's using the word nekuda achas, like one point. How does that help me understand it better than as distinguished from the other spheres? Or the other spheres are not nekudot? I mean, why dafka does he use the word nekuda achas?
The kuda is a thing that doesn't occupy space. It's like a corner. It's just a point. The other spheres have a full-bodied structure.
I see. Okay. That answers my question. I was seeing it more as a chalal, as an open chamber.
No, chalal is a tzimtzum.
Yeah, okay.
Malchus is not just a tzimtzum. Malchus has its own it just doesn't have anything of its own. Yeah, it's like yeah.
Got it. Okay. You answered my question. Thank you.
Okay, so continuing on. So Malchus now, liyesa b'chinas moka kol nevroim al keni pe'elos habitl b'kulam v'hi hamayla l'chol ha'elamis ima b'chinas Allah's man. And this level, Malchus, Maila, elevates all the worlds together with her, meaning together with Malchus, in a form of halos man. Halos man means halos mayin nukfin, the feminine waters that go from the bottom up, Malchus reaching upward, referring to all the avodah we learned earlier about halos man, that Malchus, as it goes down to Biy'a, it then elevates everything upward to godliness. Lies nafachim memuhus mugbal lemuhus alakus, b'chinas Atzilus mamish. Lies, in effect, transforming from something that is memuhus mugbal, very interesting expression, from something that personality is fundamentally defined and limited to something whose personality becomes godliness in the level of Atzilus mamish. So let me explain those words in simple English. In Atzilus, before we get to Malchus, remember the expression Iyu v'chayu ichad, Iyu v'gamu ichad. So though Atzilus is a structure, there are 10 spheres, there's Chachma, Bina, Das, Chesed, Gvura, Teferes, Netzach Yesod, Malchus, but they are completely like Ovis, Hein, Hen, and Merkava, like the forefathers, the patriarchs, complete Merkava Talakus 24/7. The Chesed, the Gvura, the Teferes, all they are serving God's purpose. It's God's divine attribute. Avram Avinu walked on this earth, was a walking personification and embodiment of Chesed. All the time, God's Chesed. You wanted to know what God's Chesed looks like, you looked at Avram Avinu. So the spheres of Atzilus are spheres higher than Atzilus, he called it before, Ein Sof or Bligvul, like Arechampin. Here they're spheres. Chesed is a sphere that's different than Gvura. But on the other hand, it has no identity of its own. All it is Chesed of Elikus. Once it enters Biy'a, Biy'a is a world of Yesh and Ivroim, no longer a Netzal. It's not just an emanation of a divine attribute. That's why in Atzilus you don't call the spheres, only you call them divine attributes. In Biy'a, they have now become created attributes. So it's true that Chesed of Biy'a evolves from Chesed of Atzilus. Like he actually says, I'm teaching it now in Tanya, chapter 6, where he talks about that within the spheres of Asiya is Mislabish, the spheres of Yetzirah, and the spheres of Biy'a, the spheres of Atzilus, within which lies Ein Sof. But Biy'a, the bottom line is now Chesed is already somewhat removed. It's still not selfish Chesed. We're not talking about Chesed and Asiya Chumri, Gashmi v'Chumri. It's Chesed of Biy'a, but you can call it, the focus more is now on the Chesed. The concept, the attribute of kindness. The word divine kindness is its source in Atzilus, but now we focus on the kindness itself, on the discipline of Gvura, on the compassion of Teferes. So it could help to give more explanation, but just think of the spheres of Biy'a as being now a yesh v'davar b'fnei atzmei. In Yetzirah, it will become even more defined. In Asiya, even more, to the point that when we talk about Chesed, Gvura, Teferes in this world, here we can even use it against God. You could feel, you know what, I'm a kind person, I have nothing to do with Elikus altogether, even though it's rooted in Elikus. So you could even do Chesed, Leumim, Chatas, you could have a Chesed of Yishmael, it could be a Chesed that's being used, kindness, that the Nazis were also kind to animals. So there's a Chesed in this world, but the Chesed can be quite distorted. The point being, the difference here is between Biy'a and Atzilus. And one of the differences he says here is one is a Mahus Mugbal. Its personality is essentially its definition and parameter with a focus on the structure of Chesed. And Atzilus, it's Mahus Elikus. So what does Malchus do, besides what he said before, that it's the creative process, carrying the energy of Atzilus, which goes into Zah in a form of Tzimtzum, from Arechampin, and then furthermore goes further channeled through Malchus to create Biy'a. The second part of Malchus is that it elevates together with it, as it yearns and seeks to reach back to the divine, it elevates the Mahus Mugbal of the spheres of Biy'a into becoming a Mahus Elikus, into Atzilus Mamish. Now, just to use the example he gave earlier, that's actually the role of a king. Remember, he said before that the king connects the nation that the Melucha Malchus connects the king and the nation. So let me elaborate on that, because I think it will help understand the pshat here. I cited already from Mitzvahs Minoi Melech, we talked about Malchus there, that Malchus is bittul. So the real role of David HaMelech, King David, Shlem HaMelech, is bittul. That's the whole story there, that when the Jews came to Shmuel Hanavi, to the prophet Shmuel, and they said, we want a king. And Shmuel got angry at them. Why do you need a king? You have God. And the Jews insisted. So he turned to Hashem, Shmuel, and Hashem said, yes, give them a king. And he appointed Shaul HaMelech, Shaul, King Saul, who would be for a while king, until later King David, and from there on Malchus Beis David, which is where real kingship reigns. Now, he explains this in Derech Mitzvah, very powerful question here. There's a mitzvah in the Torah, Sum Tasim Alecha Melech, appoint a king. So what was the problem? The Jews came, said they wanted a king. Why did Shmuel get angry at them? What did he tell them that you have God as king? The Torah says, appoint a king. It's one of the three mitzvahs that when they entered Eretz Yisrael, one of the three was Minei Melech, to appoint a king. So what's going on here? So the answer is, this is from the Alter Rebbe, but the Tzemach Tzedek explains it very beautifully, because they wanted a king for a different reason. The reason the Torah says have a king is not to replace God, God forbid. It's to have a king who's complete bittul, and his role is to be a role model, an example of what bittul is. So the nation has now an example how to connect to God through this human being. The people that Shmuel sends, they wanted a king because other nations had kings. It was more for nationalistic pride and symbolism and stuff like that. Not a king for the real reason. But Hashem said to him, nevertheless, they wanted, give them the king, and ultimately the king will lead them to Bitl. And he explains how Shaul came from the level of Bina, not Malchus. That's why ultimately he was not able to be the true king. David is Malchus because David embodies Bitl. However, because Bitl on its own has no body and no entity, that's why you need Binyan HaMalchus that comes from the Malchus of the other spheres, like we learned earlier, that doesn't have any substance. It's only this galus, the revelation of Chachma within Zah and Bina within Zah, etc. So the role of a Melech is not only to be mashpia, like the first role, to be the connection where the Melech is mashpia all the needs of the nation, like Moshe Rabbeinu, not just the spiritual needs, also the physical needs. That's what a king does. He provides for his people, but also and primarily the connection to effectuate bittul among the people, because since his inyan is Malchus, Malchus is bittul, and bittul, he causes them to have bittul that the nivraim, like he said here, should be transformed. Nefachim memahus mugbal lemahus elakus bebchinas atzilus mamish. So I just wanted to give that a little bit helpful to explain all of this. But in general, this is the role of Malchus, not always in terms of a king. Malchus, the entity of Malchus, in addition to creation, creates the connection by creating bittul in the Nivraim that they should be transformed from Mugbal to Alakus. Okay.
What's b'chinas alo asman?
So there's a whole sugi in Chassidus is based on the posuk Vatitan Teref Lebesa, which says about Malchus, Eishes Chayil Ateres Baila. The whole Eishes Chayil is essentially about Malchus. So he says Vatitan Teref Lebesa right? Vatitan Teref Lebesa. So he says Titan Teref Lebesa means Malchus descends into Biy'a. The purpose is that it should go into a state of Allah Osman, that Malchus is like the Lashon Nehura Tata is Beichin Mayim Tachtenim Beichin L'Mayim Elyenim. Nehura Tata Kara Tamid Nehura Ilah. So Malchus represents the Lakus of Atzilus as it enters Biy'a, but it retains its yearning and its semoyin, its thirst. And that's what's called Allah's man of Malchus in Biy'a. And with that, because Malchus, remember, is comes from Atzilus. So like in Perek Chav Mem Vav in Tanya, where he speaks about Yaakov Bacha, Yaakov Bacha, what's the pasuk there?
Vayishak Yaakov l'Rachel vayevk.
Right, Vayishak l'Rachel vayevk. So he explains there that Rachel was Malchus and Vayishak. That the idea, it's the yearning of Malchus as it goes into Golus, so to speak, or into the Helam of Biy'a, that it yearns and it creates a halos man, and with it elevates all the worlds. We learned about it earlier more at length. I don't remember what page it was, but more about the halos man of Malchus.
Halos man also in Biy'a.
Yeah. He says, "Amayla l'chol ha'elam is imo b'chinas halos man li'is nafachim emahus mugbiya." So when a person, for example,
so it's a yearning. It's a yearning to rise above and your level.
Halos man means to elevate the halah, the elevation of the mayim nukfin. Essentially, is another word for asurusa dilatata. So you have an expression in Kabbalah, hamshachas mad, the hamshacha of mayim tchurin. That's the hamshacha from Zah, the male. Masculine waters, mayin is water, and halos man refers to the elevation, the halos man of the mayim nukvim of the feminine waters upward. It always refers to masus tata, an awakening from below.
Yeah, I got the literal interpretation, but in prior shiurim, you in practical, because in supply terms, you've talked about it as our avoida. That
is correct. It is our avoida that when we daven and we do mitzvah, when we elevate our lives upwards from the bottom up, we're not talking about from the top down, from the bottom up. Allah's man refers karbonis tefillah.
Got it. Thank you very much.
V'zeu gamkein hayischabrus.
What is it? Atzilus mamesh. It's ne'afochim yemahus mugbul amos elokus. The yearning is to be Atzilus. They are not reaching the level of Atzilus.
That's the goal. Malchus is coming to bring bittul, like he says, pe'elos ha-bittul b'kulam, and he elevates all the worlds. Malchus does. The halos man to be transformed from a defined, limited personality to a divine personality, mamash Atzilus. The goal is to elevate beyond Atzilus. That's through avodah. That's the whole point. And la'asad that will be completely achieved, as we're going to learn, the transformation of this world into Lakus. That's the avodah. That's the goal of our avodah. This v'zeu gamken ha'ischabros b'bchinas ayin, and this is also the ischabros b'bchinas ayin, the attachment, the connection that Malchus is affecting here. Shanivroim yiyu b'chinas ayin u'bittel, that the nevroim should be in a state of ayin, of nothingness, of nullification and bittel and sublimation. V'yiyu miyuchodim mamish belakus. So he's saying this Malchus is also the ischabros in the level of ayin, that they should be miyuchodim mamish united with godliness. Valzehu yididus hamalchus be'elam is biyah. And this is the purpose of the descent of Malchus into the worlds of Biy'a. The Malchus, the Biy'a, Nasis, Keser, Va'atik, Liyetzira. So the Malchus, just like Malchus of Atzilus becomes the Keser and Atik of Biy'a, Malchus of Biy'a becomes the Keser, the crown, and the Atik, the higher level, Liyetzira, or Malchus Yetzira, Keser, Va'atik, La'asiyah. And the Malchus of Yetzira becomes the crown and the Atik of Asiyah. What's the purpose of that? In order to elevate also the level of Asiyah, and to attach it and join it and connect it to godliness. And now he broadens it. And so too, who Yeridus HaNeshama is the descent of the soul, which comes from Knesset Yisrael. That descends and manifests and gets enclosed in a body and in an animal soul. In order, what was the purpose of the neshama? Why does the neshama come down to this world into a physical body and an animal soul? In order to affect iskafia, a type of refraining and self-control. Not just refraining and avoiding, but also hisapcha, transformation of what? Chashecha l'nahera, darkness to light, like we've been learning here. Transformation. And now the last few lines of this paragraph, actually, even though there is a comma here, which I understand that's why they kept it in this paragraph. But as I mentioned a number of times, the paragraph breaks here are not by the Rebbe Rashab. They were done by the publisher, the one who prepared it for print. And I'm wondering, the Zeu Sha'amar Yenison LeDavid, whether that doesn't belong to the next paragraph. But regardless, since it's written this way, maybe because of the comma, he now is going to draw this into another verse and another concept to come to further develop the idea of how Malchus descends in order to transform. Because remember, the goal is going to be, one second, the goal is going to be, the goal is going to be that we're talking here, not just the elimination of the enemy, but the transformation, that we transform, like he explained at length earlier at the bottom of page 1299. So now to understand the transformation, we understand Malchus is like the Keren that's entering into the darker, lower worlds with the goal of elevating them and transforming them. So now he adds, and I'll just read these three lines. And this is what we say. This is actually the Haftarah that we say every Machar Chodesh. This is Haftarah that we say whenever Sunday, Shabbos is Erev Rosh Chodesh. So we say by Machar Chodesh because that's the Haftarah begins, that tomorrow will be the new year. And Yenison and David have a conversation. Because remember, King Shaul HaMelech now sees David as his mortal enemy and is pursuing him and wants to kill him. So David does not want to come and appear. So even though David and Yenison were both closest of friends and they sat at the table with Shaul, but now David is not going to come because of the threat, because danger to his life. So there's a conversation, and Yenison says to David is Bechinas Malchus Atzilus. So the Yenison is speaking to David, and he says to him, One second. I know. I just was thinking. So what does he say to him? That's what he says. And he tells him that when your seat will be missing and you will be remembered. And then he gives all kinds of signs of how he will send a sign to David HaMelech. And one of the signs he says, "V'shilashto teired me'ed."
Reb Simon, I think you're right. It belongs to the next paragraph, from Vezehu.
I know. I think so, but whatever.
You could-
Okay, fine. So be it.
Yeah, you could see the next page also. There is a new paragraph. Vezehu she'omer lo Yonasan and David yishalash uteret. This is a new. It's not a new thing, but it's based on before. It's a new thing.
Yeah, that's why. Yeah, that's why I suggested that. Yeah. So v'shilashta tered me'ed. What is v'shilashta referring to? I think he's referring to his bow and arrow, right? Something like. I think he. I have to look inside. If I recall correctly, he said he will shoot with his bow and arrow 3 arrows. And that will be a sign. Am I correct, Reb Shleim? I'm almost sure that's what it says.
I'm thinking, what is the shilashto? Yeah, that's the story with the bow and arrows, but what is the shilashto?
I think the 3. I think that your 3. I mean, he's going to explain it later here in Ruchnius. But I think that it's 3 arrows. I think something like that, if I recall correctly.
That's the story, but the direct translation from Shmuel Aleph is V'shilash ter me'od uvasa el hamakom asher nistarta sham v'yom ha'masa v'yishavta etzel le'evan ha'azel. And it says the day after tomorrow. That's shilashta, tered, go down all the way, tered me'od. It's a
Shilashta, like the 3rd day?
Correct. That's what it says.
So maybe the 3rd
But
day.
it does. The next sentence is V'ani shloshes hachitzim sida ora l'shalach li.
That's what I meant. The 3 chitzim, the 3 arrows.
Yeah.
Is there any connection to the shalashta and the 3 arrows from the simple interpretation? Not necessarily, right?
Not other than the spelling.
I don't know if it said 3 arrows, but v'shilashto, but you said Rabbi Yitzchok on the 3rd day. That makes sense, but it said 3 arrows there?
Yeah, afterwards, it says shleisha chitzim.
Correct.
Oh, yeah. Metzudas David is saying v'shilashto kol shloishes hayomim v'hem hayoim umocho umochorosoi tered me'oid liyis nistar beho emek b'mokem shenistar toshom. So Metzudas David is saying clearly that there are 3 days, and all of these 3 days, today, tomorrow, and the day after tomorrow,
You should be hidden.
You should be hidden.
Okay, so he says clearly, what's the hidden referred to? So he says, V'shilashta tered me'ed, which means you should go downward. Shibchinis hayirida lamata mata, that's the descent below. Levarer birurim, to be mevarer the birurim, which is the Allah's man of Malchus, going down below into Biy'a, ulahafcham lelakus, and to transform them to Elakus. So that's what Yonasan was saying to David. V'zel v'shilashta shetasa shlishis, u'kamei nekuda segel. And that's the v'shilashta, that it should be a triple. Like the segel is one of the punctuation marks that's made up of 3 dots, right, left, center. Shehi shleisha nekudus, it's made up of 3 points. So now he's going to explain what the 3 points are in the context of Malchus descending to be mevarer berurim, to transform them to Elakus.
So the shilashta is the descension of Malchus into Biy'a. Briyatzir and Asiya is what it sounds like. For the sake
We'll
of
see. I will not jump. We'll see how he explains it now. He's going to explain it in detail here.
Okay.
Okay, but that idea is clear. That David is Malchus, and he's descending below in a dark place in order to transform it. And this consists of 3. We have to figure out what the 3 is. That's what we're going to say by Inyan Hu. I'm going to stop here anyway. We'll stop here. What is the Inyan in this segel? Segel. This is going to go for a page or 2. Okay, so we'll stop at the end of this paragraph. Any questions?
It's very possible, like you said, that V'zeu is the beginning of the next thing, and the Ayin who is inside the paragraph, since he's talking about Segel, so he's explaining what it is.
Yeah, but you could also say that the Rebbe Rashab made a comma after Chashechel Nehera Chulu and wanted to begin by speaking about Yonasan and David, and then he makes a period, and that's why they start a new paragraph. You could say that too, that he
Okay,
just
but
says it briefly, but it makes sense that
it
it
did
really
not-
belongs to the next paragraph. I mean, either way, it's fine. The flow is still there. We understand the flow here.
But you said Rabbi Rashab did not divide the prokim here, right?
No. Today we have the Ksav Yad. They recently posted it, so you could see. I looked it up. He didn't divide any paragraphs.
Talks about why the segel is a good symbol on top of page 105. We'll get there.
Yeah, he's going to talk about it now.
Yeah.
That's the next page. That's the next discussion.
Yeah.
So we'll stop here at the end of this paragraph. Anybody has any questions on this?
You said today we have the Ksav Yad. We have it in the library, but it's not printed someplace.
It's online. You could see it online. They scanned it all. Remember, we posted it a few months ago.
So what are you putting? Ayin Beis?
Yes. Yes, that's what he said. I can send it to you, Rav Shlomo, if you want.
Thank you. I just want to know what's the access? How could you get it?
Well, the Indian, if you look at the manuscripts, he doesn't break them into paragraphs himself. It's one
No,
long.
I'm not talking about this. I'm talking about in general access to the Ksav Yad, to the whole Ayin Beis.
It's all online. Send them a link if you like.
Yeah, I'll send you the link. You can see it's on the internet. You just flip pages on the internet.
I understand, but you have to put something on the internet. What are you looking on the internet? But
The actual Ksav Yad, the actual manuscripts, the paper, and the ink that the Rabbi Rashab wrote this all on.
thank you.
Copy of it, yeah.
Yeah.
They scanned the Ksav Yad. He needs the link. That's what he's asking for.
He wanted to know what it's a picture of. It's a picture of like you're looking at a tourist.
No, he wants the link.
Uh-huh.
He wants the link.
Yeah, the link.
Yeah.
If you could send it, Rabbi Yitzchok, thank you.
Yeah, my pleasure.
Okay, we stop here. Top of page, end of the paragraph on 13.